Welcome to the K&E Podcast with your host Kenny
and Eleanor.
Do. Oh yeah, okay. Episode 2, Eleanor. How are we feeling today? Big O2.
Feeling pretty good. Feeling
Today's
good about this one.
topic is a risky business one, I would say.
This one might rock the boat a bit, but it's important to talk about, and that's racism and how it affects everyday language.
It does affect everyday language, especially with our interviewees today. We spoke to 2 of your friends. You actually interviewed them this time.
Yes.
How do you think it went?
I think it went pretty well. The interviewees, I guess I should say, have a little bit of contrasting experiences, but I think that really brings out just the differences we see in society when it comes to, I guess, racism and like how language, varies.
And we'll get all into that in a few minutes, but first, why don't we just crack open today's can of worms? So, when we think, especially in our everyday language that we use, and we think racism, it's a big talking point.
I guess when it comes to racism, whether it's everyday and in our language, you and I, it's like we don't even pick up on it sometimes. Like, of course, we try our best to not. Obviously, we're not racist, so
I would hope so.
Yeah, we don't use, I guess, like offensive language when we're talking to people of color.
We both are. I would say we both are very inclusive people,
Yes.
and of course, when it comes to inclusivity, that seeps into our dialogue a lot, and yet you and I also don't have to deal with a lot of that stuff, because we are 2 white cis women. So if we're talking specifically, let's say from a point of view of someone with maybe a heavier accent or a dialect or a certain way of speaking that they use certain kinds of slang, I know, especially from being in a position of going into education, being a teacher, you're not allowed really to use slang or terminology in a lot of classrooms. You have to have we've kind of labeled it the professional accent.
Right. Kind of a lack of any, like what you're saying, accent or like drawl or emphasis on, like if your dialect is more ethnic, you want to sound more, to be frank, white. You're trying to get rid of any difference in your voice that would make you stand out. To be professional is to be very plain almost, but like proper.
And if we're talking, even just the sound of someone's voice, if we're talking, for interviews, let's say, for example, it's kind of like the old reference point that people used to use with racism, where someone's name, so employers would look at John Smith's before they would Frida Monchaya's,
Yeah. Right.
But it's similar in the language aspect, because I almost want to say it's not even, of course, intended with a lot of people. It's just we expect what we have now come to understand as the professional tone.
Yeah.
And when we don't hear that, it's seen as not professional, uneducated, or simply just lack of trying or something like that,
Yeah. And it's harmful, obviously, because it gives anyone else who would be just as good as a professional job, right, or any kind of professional setting, it just marginalizes people based on assumptions by how they sound. Even though someone who might sound different from me could have just as much of an education and probably be even smarter on a topic, but would be considered less so for a position than me because maybe I sound more professional or conduct myself in a more white sounding way,
I think both of our interviewees of the day have a lot that we can go off of, so why don't we go ahead and get on into these interviews today.
Yep.
Brandon, are you aware that you are being recorded?
I am.
And are you consenting the use of this audio?
I am.
Aparna, are you aware that you are being recorded?
Yes.
And are you consenting to the use of this audio?
Yeah.
Which category would you say best summarizes your ethnicity?
Asian, for sure.
African American.
Do you have a different professional tone when speaking with a person in a position of power than you normally would in everyday conversation?
I do.
Please elaborate on that for me.
Well, I think everybody does to a certain extent. I mean, you're not going to talk to somebody that is like your boss the same way you would talk to an employee, or at least I wouldn't.
Right.
So I think that's where that comes from.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's some slang terms that I feel like a lot of so living in the South for like a few years, I feel like I picked up a lot of, slang that could be considered African American vernacular English, and I feel like that's usually how I talk to a lot of my friends. But especially when I'm at work or talking to professors, I feel that I have to almost like whiten my speech, for lack of a better term. I feel like I have to really put all the G's at the end of my verbs, or to articulate every single word better, so people don't think I'm speaking in slang or sound uneducated, because I'm more scared of that with my skin color sometimes.
Have you ever found yourself or been accused of speaking quote unquote white?
Oh, definitely. And this actually goes like several directions for me, because I feel like at work, I find myself speaking white a lot, because I feel like I have to not use slang, or maybe not talk the way I want to or normally do with my coworkers, so they'll take me more seriously. And then also with the Indian community, I feel like it's really funny that a lot of other Indians almost gatekeep Indian culture, especially like American-born Indians. They'll kind of gatekeep the culture, saying I'm not Indian enough because I speak more white, or that I like have adopted more, I don't know, like Americanized fashion or whatever it is, that I'm more white than they are and therefore not as Indian as them. I feel like I found myself in situations like that a lot as well.
No, not necessarily. I feel like some people might think of, when you try to speak professionally, they might try to say that you're speaking white, but they'll never say it. So me personally, I haven't been told that before, but I know that I do have a customer service voice.
Have you ever found yourself or been accused of quote unquote speaking black?
No.
Like having a black scent? Probably not, I don't think. Because I mean, like, this is where being brown really comes into handy, is I feel like I'm racially ambiguous enough to where I can kind of get away with. I don't use the N-word or anything like that, but I don't think I've ever been called out for talking like, like, oh, I'm trying to sound like black or something like that, or like I'm trying to sound ghetto, quote unquote.
Have you ever been told in your life that you would have to alter your speech to sound more quote unquote professional?
Not directly to my face, I don't think. I don't think I've ever been told to like alter my speech. I think I kind of did it myself, just from working at my first professional job over the summer, kind of seeing how other people talked. I figured that I would have to for people to take me seriously, that I'd have to alter my speech to that. So I was more mirroring that pattern of behavior than being outright directly told that I needed to act that way.
Yeah, actually, even with some classes that I've taken before, a big emphasis has been not to use the word when you're speaking. So being in the professional world and trying to give like speeches and stuff, they try to encourage you not to use the word which is, I feel, is correct. So in that sense, yes.
Have you ever been treated differently because of your pattern of speech? If so, how?
I don't know if I've been treated differently. Maybe the people said something behind closed doors, but I've never had anything said to my face before. So.
I don't think because of my pattern of speech. I think when I speak a different language, yes, I think that kind of gets me some sideways looks sometimes in public, but I don't think I've been told my pattern of speech I don't think my pattern of speech has really been a reason for someone to treat me differently. It's usually something else, like the skin color, honestly.
Do you feel society is more accepting of slang or different speech patterns?
Yes, and that's actually something I was just talking about today with one of my friends, was I feel like a lot of, AAVE, or like African American vernacular English, was looked up like down upon as being uneducated or quote unquote ghetto or something like that, like other words, trashy, whatever it was. Well, it was really looked down on as like pretty, like it was really looked down upon. And I think with the rise of a lot of social media trends, like, especially with TikTok using a lot of like slang terms like, oh, understood the assignment, or like chuggy, or things like that have now been like popularized and commodified by white people, it's become cool. So I feel like 5-6 years ago, a lot of things that I would say were looked down upon, and now they've become cool and like popular again. So I think that's a really interesting thing to look into.
Completely. I think so. I think people are into what we call as hip now.
Mm-hmm.
People are more accepting of different slang terminology than ever before, and it's probably a big part to do with music too.
Yeah.
I think everybody's listening to different styles of music, and a lot of the music are using some of the same slang terms.
Thank you so much, Aparna, for helping me out with this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right, so that was a lot. There was a lot of differences in their answers to the questions, and I know because you were the interviewer, you probably have a lot more kind of insight to this, but it seemed like it was oddly, one was oddly defensive over some of the questions, and the other was very open, very personal, telling stories and whatnot. How did it go for you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, when interviewing Brandon, he seemed very more to the point, kind of more black and white, yes and no, question or answers to the question. Sorry, but whereas when I talked with Aparna, she seemed kind of ready to get into it, kind of off the beat, was expecting some of the questions. So she definitely gave a little bit more in-depth answers, which was, it's always for our listeners, which is good for the listeners out there. With Brandon, it was a little more on the surface. I feel like we could have definitely dug a little deeper, but everyone's experiences are different. So I think these interviews show that you also can't put people in a box and assuming that maybe everyone's had a similar experience as a person of color.
That's a very good point, actually. Yeah. Because we knew going into today's episode, this is, it's a very touchy subject for some people, but then you got to think not everybody grew up in a certain scenario, not everybody faced challenges that maybe other people did. Right. And I think that's the good thing that we got from today's episode. We got an African-American man and an Indian woman who both have obviously lived extremely different lives, right, who both experienced some forms of racism against themselves, or maybe just what they understood as, it's just natural. You just naturally have to, for example, speaking with a person in a position of power over you, you and I both, we can understand that. Right. We can understand you have to be more professional. You have to be more prepared to answer, explain, give reasoning, research, all this sort of stuff. But then I think with you and I, we don't necessarily ever, I think, get accused of speaking white, for example. Right. No. Or speaking black.
Like, the only feedback I've ever had when I've given a presentation or prepared for some type of interview is that I need to cut down on filler words, kind of like what Brandon was saying. I related to some of his answers, just the or, trying to, and stuff like that.
Just trying to make it flow easier.
Right. Whereas with Aparna, her experiences, that's where some of the differences are between what we've gone through as a white woman and an Indian woman, whereas she felt more pressure to have to change how she talks to make it in a professional setting,
It was very funny. One question you asked, I don't remember which one it was, but she almost immediately, you didn't use any sort of...
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
You didn't use any sort of word to lead her to think about it, but almost immediately the first word that came to her mind was it was like blaccent.
Right. Like, have you ever used a dialect different from your own
that you had to alter your speech? Yeah.
Right. And she knew exactly what I meant by that.
Yeah. And it's almost odd because Aparna herself, I will say, doesn't necessarily sound like what stereotypical Indian folks would sound like.
Right.
Especially, I think that's...
growing up in the United States, being in, like she said, having to kind of mirror a little bit, or, growing up in the school systems here, or whatever, work or college, whatever it is, probably takes away from how a stereotypical Indian accent would sound.
Yeah, and she even mentioned how there are some folks in her community that almost feel, more highly of themselves than they would her because they, they're not as Americanized. They're not as deep into the culture. And you gotta think both ways. It can be hard, I'm sure, to be accused of having kind of like a white accent, but then the loss of people thinking, oh, well, you're clearly Indian because I recognize your accent. They look at her differently for the way she speaks.
There's kind of microaggressions there on both sides
Absolutely.
of the spectrum. It's either, oh, well, you don't sound Indian.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, what's an Indian person, in the United States sound like? But then there's also, oh, you sound Indian, or whatever you would say. It's like, oh, you can't. There's microaggressions there on both sides. It's like pointing out the fact that someone has a strong accent or not is kind of, I don't know, interesting territory.
And one thing that I will say with both of them, I think they both kind of agreed to this question, the question of, is society more accepting of slang? But they both had extremely different reasons as to why. They both said yes, which I think we both can agree with. Our society does. It's not even just understanding the slang nowadays. It's using it in everyday language. I mean, for example, like, Yas, queen, boots the house down, all that kind of stuff,
Yeah. Yes. Or, wig.
Yeah, snatched, all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And I would say a lot almost of these terms are things that, like Aparna said, we see on social media, TikTok or Instagram or even Twitter, for example.
Right.
It's become more accepted because it's more common.
Right. Like, a lot of speech that honestly does originate from Black culture is more widespread, I would say, on social media, whereas a lot of white people wouldn't even really know it unless you pointed it out. Like, oh, a lot of those terms that you and I just said aren't necessarily, white terms at all.
No. And I really liked Aparna's entire interview, to be honest. I liked that she mentioned how it became more accepted the more common it became because of people who aren't people of color using it. Because if you think about it, especially back in the day, when you would think about certain terminology that would be used, it wouldn't be allowed in a public setting because it's just not common. It's not professional. It's not,
right.
Think of the children.
Yeah.
And nowadays, that's all the children think of.
Yeah. Zoomers.
So, yeah, well, of course.
Yeah.
And honestly, I will say, I think a big point that you and I both learned from today's episode that I hope our viewers do learn too is while, yes, there are different scenarios that people live through, of course, there are different things that we all understand. We come from different backgrounds, and so we face different challenges. I think in an overall idea, the big message is just, pardon my French, to be very blunt, just don't be an asshole.
Right.
Yeah, just, because if someone speaks different from you, if you can understand them, it's not a problem. It's just the way they speak.
Yeah. People didn't choose where they came from, and then you don't choose what area you happen to live in. And just the assumption that if you sound a certain way, you're less educated, you don't sound as professional. I don't know. It's just, I think it's phasing out. I think it's phasing out of our society and Western culture, but it's still there, especially with older generations.
I was just about to say it in the same vein.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that. It is, honestly, it's odd because the older generations are the ones who tend to have the problems with it, and yet they're the ones who raised us, the younger generations, who we're just like, whatever.
Right.
It's cool. You're living your life. I'm living mine.
Yeah. Obviously, I think what we consider, our generation anyway, would consider sounding professional is just don't say, I don't know, fuck, shit, bitch. You know? I don't know. Just
maybe keep those words just out of the podcast.
Right. Just know, you have to realize that you're in a more, I don't know, like, professional atmosphere. You don't swear, I guess would be the only tip. avoid filler words, don't swear, and I mean, that's about it. If you can conduct yourself in an appropriate manner.
If you take nothing else from today's episode, just learn those 2 rules. Avoid filler words, avoid swears.
There you go.
There you go. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in to today's episode. I hope we at least got you thinking about something. If you like today's episode, we'd love to hear what you think. Go ahead and comment in whatever comment section you have below.
Yes, give us your feedback.
We'd love to hear it. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you next episode.
See ya.
Raised us, the younger generations, who we're just like, whatever.
Right.
It's cool. You're living your life. I'm living mine.
Yeah. Obviously, I think what we consider, our generation anyway, would consider sounding professional is just don't say, I don't know, fuck, shit, bitch. You know? I don't know. Just
maybe keep those words just out of the podcast.
Right. Just know, you have to realize that you're in a more, I don't know, like, professional atmosphere. You don't swear, I guess would be the only tip. Avoid filler words, don't swear, and I mean, that's about it. If you can conduct yourself in an appropriate manner. If you take
nothing else from today's episode, just learn those 2 rules. Avoid filler words, avoid swears.
There you go.
There you go. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in to today's episode. I hope we at least got you thinking about something. If you like today's episode, we'd love to hear what you think. Go ahead and comment in whatever comment section you have below.
Yes, give us your feedback.
We'd love to hear it. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you next episode.
See ya.
Do.